Uh, all right, so going component driven. What that's about is about decomposing screens. So say you are a front end developer and you get tasked of building screens and pages. So this is what you might get as a deliverable from a designer, a bunch of screens. So what you do is you start drilling down in these screens. So for example, take this example where you have a build screen from Chromatic. So this is the app that I'm working on. So these are actual designs. This is just like a sketch file. It's enormous. So you start drilling down further, and you can start to identify some elements, right? Header, sidebar, build summary, and comments in this case. So um, then you take a step further, and you can drill down even more. Let's take a look at this build summary here. This is the point where you can start to pick out individual components that you typically reuse across screens and features and pages. So say these cardinal numbers or buttons, like the canonical example, the status bar that lives on this page, badges and avatars. Those are all reusable components. And I mean, this is the stuff that you deal with in day-to-day life as a front-end developer, right? It's nothing new there, but let me tell you, this whole UI development, it's just a game of composition. So now that you've like drilled down into your design, identifying individual components, perhaps your designer has actually already done that and built these drilled down for you and given you the design of individual components. And then your job starts to recompose all those components to form features and screens and pages in your app or website. So this is me, I'm Gert Hengeveld. I'm a software engineer at Chromatic. Chromatic is mostly known as the company behind Storybook. So if you happen to know Storybook, you might be familiar with that. Otherwise, I'll show it later. And Chromatic, we also build our own software as a service platform that essentially provides a whole workflow around Storybook. So around working with Storybook. If you'd like to know more about this subject, about going component-driven development, you can always follow me on Twitter. I often tweet about everything related to front-end development, UI engineering, component-driven development. So modern user interfaces, they are not only just built from components, they are assembled from components. That's the trend. Like we're more and more just relying on the components already existing in like a design system or a component library or whatever. And then it's our job to take those components and build new screens, new features inside an already existing app. That's the typical use case. Well, this has various benefits, such as that the quality of your work can improve because you get to verify that the individual components work in various scenarios. You don't just tackle the best case scenario, you tackle also the error scenarios and such. Efficiency, you obviously can reuse all these components. Like that's the whole benefit of working in a component-driven way, reusing them in various places, so you don't have to build every screen from scratch. Then speed, you can actually parallelize the development of components across people within your team, but also across teams, which is a pretty big deal for big companies which have multiple software engineering teams working together to build a plethora of apps that all have to look familiar and similar and preferably use the exact same components all over the place, right? And durability, you get to pinpoint bugs at component level. So if you have a bug, it's easier to drill down into your component tree and figure out where the issue lives exactly in your component tree, and then debug that one component that you have already pinpointed. But building components, it's complicated. It's not an easy job, right? So you get to deal with flaky data in your app. So say you have a web app and you're building a new component within that app. In order to get your component in a particular state, you often have to click through the app to trigger some particular scenario, like an error case or a loading state or something like that. And reproducing that state can be pretty hard. Sometimes even impossible. Like maybe you have to like make changes in your database or something like that to break stuff. You have to deal with tangled business logic. Like if you develop within an app itself, you have to deal with the context of having routing or other like context of state that live within your app. Say a user is signed in or is not signed in. If you are doing it manually, you would have to like if you're developing a component within the app, you would have to sign in and then test it there and then sign out again to test it there, right? That's a lot of work, and it gets increasingly complex as you have more business logic intertwined with your components. And then there is the issue of unfinished APIs, or essentially just waiting for backend developers to finish their side of the job, or the other way around, of course, happens as well. But if you're, as a front-end developer, building a new component and you have to have the data structure or the data itself in place already, and you're not the one whose job it is to figure out how to build that, then you get to wait around, right? So what then after would happen is that you spend a week building something and then 2 weeks doing nothing on that particular feature, and then after 2 weeks you have to get back into whatever you were doing before. So that context switching is annoying. All right, so this is where Storybook comes in. So Storybook is a front-end tool for building user interface components faster and easier. It does that by allowing you to build those components in isolation. So basically a component sandbox. That's what we call it. And then catalog all the various components that you have within your app or within even the entire company, and all their various states. And I'll get to what the state is in a moment. And the Storybook is great and pretty unique, actually, in the sense that it works with every view layer, meaning every UI library, such as React, Angular, Ember, just HTML5, web components, even React Native. So right, it works with all of those systems. So it's trying to not like force you in a particular direction there. And sneak peek, by the way, these add-ons that you can install, they can soon be installed right from within Storybook. We're working on an add-on gallery, just like kind of similar to what Visual Studio Code does. You can search for add-ons. We promote particular add-ons, saying these are the most popular ones, and one-click install, and you have an add-on in your Storybook. All right, so building components in isolation, essentially what that means is you write your code in your editor, VS Code, or some IDE that you're using. And what happens is that as soon as you save your code file, the canvas or the sandbox, if you will, in Storybook reloads automatically and displays the current state of that component as it lives in the code. Which is great because you don't have to deal with the entire context of the rest of the app. You can just focus on this one component. And cataloging variants and states is represented in the tree view, in the catalog of your Storybook. So say you have this graph component and it has three different states, like a default state, which is typically like your ideal scenario, and an empty state, which in which case you don't have any data, and some normalized state in this particular example, which that depends on what your story is about, your component is about. All right, so going component driven means that you start from by building these components in a bottom-up approach. Then you combine these components to form bigger components. So let me say very clearly that it is not the idea of Storybook to only be building these add-on components, say a button or some toggle or some other kind of very small thing. No. The idea is that you use these components to build up bigger components. So you could have the entire page header in there, which consists of other components such as a search bar, which consists of an input field and a button, right? Or the logo or the navigation menu. That's all part of the header. Well, so that way you compose your components together to build bigger components. And finally, you even go so far as to build entire pages in Storybook. So that's what we do at Chromatic. We have stories in our Storybook for all of the pages in our app. Meaning that I can click through our Storybook and see the entire scope of what the project is about, really, without even booting the actual app. So finally, you assemble your app using these components, these page components or screen components, and you inject the actual data in there, and then you have like a full-fledged app, right? That's the idea. And Storybook kickstarts this workflow by allowing you to first develop these components in isolation. So with your team, you build this component library, and I'm saying that is not just small components, but actual screens and such as well. Those are also in your component library. And then you assemble your app from those components. So let's look at an example of what it looks like in Storybook. This is a typical stories file. So it's like a button.stories.js file that you would typically write when you're using Storybook. So that starts with a title, which actually represents the path to a component. So you can create a tree structure in Storybook, and you do that by separating a path with slashes. And then you have, in this case, 3 stories. Notice that, by the way, this is just a JavaScript module file, right? It has some imports, some exports, and that's it. There is no particular Storybook API anymore. That used to be there. We used to have a thing called stories of, which was very particular to Storybook. We went a step further and we introduced something called component story format, which is essentially it's a file format, which is it's just vanilla JavaScript. And we intentionally made it that way so that this component story format can be used by more tools than just Storybook. And that's actually what's happening. There's integrations with various design tooling. I believe InVision design system or something. They are using something like that. There is webcomponents.dev, which is like an online IDE for web components, and also other kinds of component libraries that use CSF. So you can use this file for more than just describing your Storybook. But anyway, where this ends up is in the tree view in your Storybook. So you would end up with something like this, a button with 3 stories underneath, and then the canvas that renders that particular story. Someone previously mentioned, he was obviously a kind of a Storybook power user, but said like, hey, can't I just write a for loop, because you're just repeating the same thing 3 times over with only the appearance property changing. That's true. So if you are a Storybook power user, you would typically actually use something called Storybook args to do this. With Storybook args, you essentially write kind of like a blueprint for your story, and then you make copies of it and inject different props each time for each of them. So you get to describe your stories in data rather than in JSX, like here. So that's kind of a power feature. But if you're interested in that, Google for Storybook args and you will find it. All right, so let's talk about these component variants, aka stories. There is a bunch of things that you can use this for. There's like, you previously saw this example with a primary and secondary appearance of a button, which is just like variations on the theme, like color-wise or such. But there is way more that you could consider here. So there's various states that a component can be in, like it's a loading state, or it's disabled, or something is in progress because you just click the button, or it's in an error state, or say you have an accept deny thing, or an expanded collapse because it's an expandable component, right? That depends, of course, on your component, but there's plenty of things to think about here. And then take it one step further, you have to think about, you get to think about the edge cases that this component could have. So long or short text, what happens if you pass in a very long text into a particular component? How does the text wrapping work? Or does it like truncate or something like that? Big or small images, this is the same thing. Do you scale the image in a way, or do you crop it, or what happens? Extreme numbers, so say something takes the number, what happens if you pass in a negative number, or 0, or like a million? What happens, right? Missing data, that can be like the user has just signed up and he doesn't have any data in the system, so there is nothing to display. That was an early example you saw with the graph, right? Or even missing data in the sense that it's still loading, right? That might also, that's kind of a different thing. Special characters, so you get to deal with char sets and like Chinese and left to right and right to left text, right? That's something that you could consider. And then there's context. So a component, like while you develop it in Storybook, it lives in isolation, but in practice, like in the app, it lives in a certain context, right? So a component might display differently based on whether it's used in some standalone fashion or composed within another component, or you have to deal with the fact that your component is different based on whether a user is signed in or not, or the language or location of the user, or whether this user is offline or it's a first-time user, like I mentioned. So there's a bunch of things that you can consider. And what's worse, I would say, is there's endless combinations of these things, right? And if you are used to writing unit tests for your code, it's a very similar thought process. It's like, oh, I have to take care of all these edge cases. I write a unit test for each of these edge cases. It is very similar when you're writing stories. So let's look at an example. Say you have this default version of a page header, and then there is a loading state, right? But also something with a very long title. I just passed in a very long text. What happens? Well, I don't think this looks very pretty, so maybe we want to have to do something about this. I don't know, maybe change the scaling of the text, or crop it after 3 lines, or I don't know what. Here's an example from our own Storybook. So you get to see what happens when you start combining states, right? So there is this one tooltip which uses other components inside. So there is, on each tooltip, there is 3 lines, each of them using a status icon, the dot, right? The colored dot. So sure, everything might be green. That's fine. But what happens when like stuff is still in progress, or stuff is not completed? Or in this scenario, there is something with regards to the context. Because in Chromatic, you have the option to sign in with GitHub, or the option to sign in with GitLab or with Bitbucket. But GitLab is special in the sense that pull requests on GitLab are called merge requests. So for this particular component, we actually have a variation for GitLab specifically, which says an MR check rather than a PR check, because it's about merge requests rather than pull requests. Right? That's a kind of context that you could consider. All right, so now you start composing components to create screens. So here's an example, an actual example from our code base. This is the pull request screen within Chromatic. So you see in the top left here that we have this pull request directory, and there's a whole bunch of components underneath. So that's how we built up this screen. We built it up by creating new components that are particular to this screen, and only in the end do we have a pull request screen where it all comes together. So this tooltip you just saw was one of those things. There's a pull request check tooltip right here. It's one of those. So in the screen, we're not obviously going to repeat all of those variations again. Typically, we take like the best case scenario and a couple variations, such as the loading version or something like that. But that's how we also get to test the whole screen as like in various states and variations, right? So the loading version of the whole screen, or when there is some activity or there is no activity on this screen, or it's a first time user, so they get shown some explainer, like a tooltip, or there's comments on this page, and there's versions where the change set, where there is a change or not, right? There's a ton of variations that you can have. All right, so when you get to the details of implementing this, you might run into various issues. So I made an example with React, but this applies typically to other frameworks as well. But what if my component has internal state? How do you deal with that? Because what you should want to do is make stories for each of the variations of the component. But if the state lives within the component, how do you deal with that? How do you make a story for each variation? Well, what you do is you take that component apart. You create a presentational component which only renders itself based on a set of properties, props, or whatever it's called in a different library. And then you have a container component around it that keeps track of the state and then passes that along to the underlying component. So here we have a collapsible component which keeps some internal state on whether it's collapsed or not. And then we have a collapsible view, which is a presentational component, which does nothing but render something based on its props. And now the trick is to write stories only for the presentational component. So the presentational component is something you can easily write a story for because it's purely based on props. And then the collapsible, you might be thinking, okay, what happens to the container component? That's where like a unit test comes in, right? Jest or something like that. You use jest for something, to test those things. All right, so what if my component uses global state or context? So that is very typical if you use a global state manager such as Redux or MobX or one of the other gazillion variations there, or something like a routing framework, React Router or Angular, whatever router they use, right? So it relies on some sort of a global state. Well, the trick there is to wrap your stories in the decorator so that you can provide that context to the underlying component. However, that context is a fake context. So we just pass mock data in there. So that, say I have a provider for React Router, I can pass in a fake URL in there, right? To say what path are we currently on. Of course, that depends on the component whether or not it needs that data in the first place. So here's an example of using decorators to do that. If you want to know more, you can read that at the documentation. So teams all around the world write thousands of stories. We ourselves at Chromatic, we have some 16 or 1700 stories in our code base. There are teams out there with like a multiple of those, and it's used all over the world, and quite successfully. I mean, it's a very big project. However, what happens is that covering all the permutations of the components, that's like a lot of work. So say you have those 1500 stories in your Storybook code base. How are you going to test it, right? Are you going to manually click through each of those stories every time you make a change and do like QA before a release? No, that would be pretty impossible actually. Because what happens is, say you have hundreds of components in your Storybook. Then you like it expands into thousands of stories, and then you might want to test against multiple browsers, right? Or viewports. You have mobile and desktop and such, right? It gets out of hand real quickly. Like, this is not something you can do manually. So what starts to happen if you don't do the proper QA there is that bugs slip through. So say I have the same component and it lives on 3 screens, and I make a change to that component, and well, previously everything was fine, but I made the change, and I look at the first screen and say, okay, that looks good. And then the second screen, it looks good. And before I did the release, I looked at those 2 screens and was, okay, good, let's ship it. However, there was a third screen that I didn't consider when doing manual QA, and that one's broken. And it takes a customer to actually report that to us, right? It's not a situation you want to be in. I mean, most companies don't, at least. So the solution there is to do visual regression testing. Visual regression testing is essentially taking screenshots of the component before and after each change. And then you don't take just the screenshot of the one component that you worked on. No, you also take screenshots of all the other places where this component lives. So all the like the composite components and screens and pages. And then you can compare them pixel by pixel to see what changed in there. So what actually happens here is you write stories, but you get tests for free. You get these tests automatically. And that's exactly what component story format is for, to get these tests for free. So now you can say, okay, you can have an automatic check that compares all these screenshots, says, okay, first one, this looks good, this one looks good, and this one doesn't. Of course, the system won't be able to say whether it's good or not. That's a manual thing. But it will just present you with all the things that have changed, and then you get to say, okay, this looks good and this doesn't. Because it still takes a human eye to verify whether or not something is a good change or not. And this is exactly what Chromatic does. So Chromatic automatically tests your whole storybook to detect these visual changes. And then you get to approve all the various changes as a sanity check before merging and shipping your changes. And there's more. Because UI development is teamwork, right? It's not just me as a single developer doing this stuff. There is designers that want to make corrections. There is QA personnel that should actually be part of the development cycle, but typically only like look at a staging environment, and that's when it's already too late, actually. Product owners or product managers, they want to check for the deliverables, right? They want to know what's up and what they can tell their customers, saying, hey, this stuff shipped in the recent release. And everyone wants to be aware of various new features because we probably have to support it over the long haul, right? So there's this additional thing where you also, with Chromatic, you get to compare across branches. So you can visualize pull requests. Just like you have a pull request in GitHub where you can compare code before and after or across branches before merging to see what's the difference between, like, what will actually happen if you merge this pull request. You now can do that also with screenshots. You see exactly what happens. And you can have your team review that stuff and approve it before merging it. And have a status badge on your pull request that says, okay, all the tests are passed and it's been approved by a team member. So going component driven, to recap, it's all about building one component at a time and then combining these components to and finally assemble screens and pages. And then you integrate these pages. These pages are just full components or screens, whatever you want to call them, and you integrate them into your app by injecting the actual data. This is it. If you'd like to know more about that, look at componentdriven.org. I'm Gert Hengeveld, and thank you for watching.